Hey everyone, Colin's here. So some big shakeups just happened in the Flesh and Blood world. We've got a banning announcement that was pretty impactful. So I wanted to drop a video that was going to share my thoughts on the bans and their impact on the kind of hero tier lists and some of my predictions surrounding the changes in the metagame that we're going to see and which heroes I'm going to recommend people pay more attention to after the bans. So I'm going to start with going over kind of what my understanding of the tier list of the heroes was going into the bans. And then we'll talk about the bans and kind of my expectation of how they're going to shake up this tier list and the metagame that we're going to be seeing at the Pro Quests coming up. So before the bans, I think there were two pretty clear S tier heroes, and these were the Ice heroes. So we had Oldhim at the top and Icelander as well. And these two were kind of competing for kind of like the number one slot. I think you can make arguments for either one. Oldhim is just generally above rate on all axes. Oldhim had access to kind of three broken mechanics that set him apart from everybody else. Those being the Icy Hammer, which, we'll talk about being banned and the impact of that. Crown of Seeds, obviously, is just a card that had an enormous impact on card filtering and, defensive elements. And then the third element that I think set Oldhim apart from everybody else was the ability to Ice React. Icelander also definitely S tier going into the bans. I think that Icelander compared to Oldhim maybe saw less success on the tournament level not because of hero level power in my mind, but more because Icelander is just more difficult to pilot appropriately. I think that a perfectly piloted Icelander deck is probably going to outperform a perfectly piloted Oldhim deck, but because we're all human and we're going to make mistakes and not play it optimally, unless your name is Michael Hamilton. Icelander, I think, saw a little less success kind of statistically over these first couple of Pro Quests this season. Icelander just has access to kind of a game-breaking endgame with the Stormstrider's boots and being able to have really excellent plans against both control decks and aggro decks was really part of its repertoire. You were able to set up a kind of a combo finish against a control deck, so you had that late game potential of being able to set up your combo finish and close out the game without really much say from your opponent as long as you operated it appropriately. And then Icelander was really effective at being disruptive against aggressive decks, just like giving them frostbites, making them discard cards. Hypothermia was a big part of that, and that's gone now. So we'll talk about that as well in a little bit. And then going down to A tier, and there's some argument whether or not Phi should have been A tier or S tier. In my mind, Phi was A tier. I think that my main argument for that is that Phi was just a little less powerful than Icelander and Oldhim. But definitely a strong hero. You're the best aggro deck. You have extremely explosive turns. And overall, the consistency, I think, is really what sets it apart from the other aggressive decks in the format. And before the bans, I think that the other A tier deck was Dash. And when I talk about Dash, I'm pretty much primarily talking about hybrid Dash. I think that the other builds of Dash are significantly worse because the main strength of Dash is its ability to play these two very different game plans and be able to choose which game plan you're playing based on the hero that you're playing against. So yeah, being able to be a control deck against the heroes where that is appropriate is really powerful. Mainly Guardians, the pistol control, very effective there. And then being able to be aggressive into the other aggro decks where control isn't really going to get you there is also really powerful. So Dash has the ability to race really well against Phi. You have some really good tools now out of Dash that are really great against Phi, mainly the Harpoon boost card and Maximize Velocity. Just being able to push that extra damage, make your opponent block. Going down to B tier, I think B tier, probably the best B tier deck was Briar. Briar, I have in B tier. Some people might have Briar in A tier, but I have Briar in B tier because I do think that Briar is a worse aggro deck than Phi. And my argument for that is just purely based on consistency. Briar has highs and lows. You can definitely high roll people with some combo turns. I've seen plenty of screenshots from Pro Quests these past couple of weekends that involved, Briar dumping 10 cards on the table in a turn. So the highs are high, certainly, but the lows also are very low. You can draw hands that can't attack. In my mind, that's a pretty significant downside. I really look for consistency in decks that I take to tournaments like Pro Quests. especially in a game like Flesh and Blood where you only get one game. I think that the inconsistency is kind of a main downside of Briar. Additionally, before the bans, Hypothermia was a very oppressive card for Briar. Briar really leans on the ability to give these 4 attacks go again that wouldn't otherwise have them. And Hypothermia's ability to shut that down was really powerful. However, Hypothermia is gone, so we'll discuss that impact as well in a little bit. Another deck that I believe to be B tier was Bravo. Bravo, I think, is pretty strong, but definitely behind Oldhim in a lot of regard. Bravo benefits from having a good matchup spread. Bravo's not doing anything too exciting. I mean, Crippling Crush is definitely a very powerful card, but Bravo had good matchups against Fi and Icelander in my mind, but really suffered against the control side of Dash and against Oldhim. I think that you're just a little behind in rate against Oldhim. Another deck that I have in B tier is Dromai. I do think that Dromai is very powerful, but the reason that I have Dromai in B tier and not higher than that is because it has a very strange matchup spread. The matchups are really polarized. I think that Dromai is very good against these top tier heroes, Oldhim and Icelander, and Dash as well. I think that Dromai has a very good Dash matchup. But Dromai really suffers against the aggressive decks. So Fi is a terrible matchup for Dromai, and it also suffers against Bravo and Briar in my mind. So given that a lot of these really popular decks are going to be very difficult for Dromai, in terms of Dromai's ability to take down a tournament, I just think that it suffers there. I think that you're just very likely to play a couple of Fis in a tournament because of its popularity, and that's not where you want to be as a Dromai player. I think that Dromai is one of those picks that you could go for in a smaller field where you know there's not going to be a lot of Fi. But in pretty much all of the ProQuests that I played in so far, Fi has been almost close to half of the field. So that's pretty treacherous for Dromai, and I think it suffers because of that. Another B tier hero, Viserai. Viserai used to be considered S tier, but kind of as things have evolved, I think that Viserai has kind of dropped down a little bit in popularity. Viserai certainly has access to some pretty broken turns, and as an aggressive deck, does the best against these more controlling builds that I think traditionally aggro suffers against. So I think Viserai has, a decent Oldhim matchup, where Oldhim is traditionally very good at beating up on these aggressive decks. Viserai's ability to kind of like save up a bunch of rune chants for one big turn was a really strong play pattern for Viserai. But again, I think that if you're looking to, play against decks that are looking to race, like, the aggro side of Dash, Fi, Briar, I think that all of those decks are just going to be a little faster than Viserai, and as a result, Viserai doesn't really have a lot of tools that are going to be able to change that dynamic. So I think that puts Viserai kind of mid B tier for me. Another B tier hero is Drenthia. I think that Drenthia is a deck that is relatively underexplored. If Drenthia is going to make any movements on this tier list, I think it can only go up in my mind, because Drenthia is doing something a little unique and pretty powerful with the attack reaction strategy. As it stands in its current form, though, I don't think that it just has that power level that is going to push it into A tier. Some of the benefits for Drenthia is that Drenthia is difficult to play against, so you can definitely catch a lot of players off guard if they're not familiar with the kind of attack reactions that you have. And also, it kind of has this nice diversity of attack reactions that can punish decisions on base that your opponents might make. Like being able to Twinning Blade after your opponent overblocks is just something that's really strong and can put you ahead in the game. But things kind of have to line up well for Drenthia in my mind, so I think that puts Drenthia at B tier. And then the last B tier hero for me is Rhinar. Everybody always talks about the inconsistency of Rhinar, and I do think that there is an element of inconsistency to Rhinar that pushes it down to B tier, but it's not about dice rolling. It's actually just about when you are able to get your good Blood Rush turns off. I think that, kind of similar to Briar, Rhinar relies on those big turns facilitated by its key card. And Rhinar's key card is Blood Rush, whereas Briar's is Channel Not Heroic. But it really needs to see that to be able to push high damage turns. There are builds of Rhinar that go more in on the go again 6-power attacks, but I've, in my experience, have found that there's a pretty significant downside in those cards not being able to block. So if you're filling your deck up too much with those, all of a sudden you're not blocking very well, And then if you don't have those in your deck, you're kind of locking yourself into this tempo of, attack for 6, blocks for 6 every turn, which a lot of the other heroes are going to be able to go over the top of that kind of strategy. So Reinhardt, solid deck, but I think kind of bottom of B tier for me. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the C and D tier heroes, but I will say that I think going into the bans, the C tier heroes were Lexi and Kano. I think these decks and these heroes were definitely capable of getting wins and could be pretty strong, but when you compare them to the consistency and power level of the other decks above it, I don't think that these are quite there. And then at the bottom tier, we've got these kind of leftovers. We've got Bolton, Azalea, Levia, Katsu, and Arachne. These are all heroes that I think are just a little less powerful than everybody else. I think that they each have some things going for them, but Katsu is just strictly worse. Arachne is, the card pool for Arachne is just far too low for it to be powerful right now. Levia struggles way too much with blood debt. If your opponent decides to play defensive and wait for your off turns deep into the game, you just get blown up. Azalea is just can never really attack for more than 9 on a turn. And, while you might be able to attack for 9 with some pretty significant disruptive elements, there are heroes just that can go way over the top of that. And Bolton, Lumina do go boomina, but I think that the power level of the surrounding deck is low enough so that you kind of are forced into this play pattern of block until you're able to go off with Lumina, and there are too many games where that can go wrong. So this is kind of where I think things stood going into the bans, and then we'll talk about what happened. So the biggest one on this list, I think, is pretty easily Winter's Wail being banned. Winter's Wail was, as they talk about in this article, just way too good for a one-handed weapon. Being able to keep a one-card hand after you block with 3 cards, or ice react. Being able to swing for 4 that is pretty much guaranteed to do something disruptive on your opponent's turn as long as it's icy. They can take 4 and get a frostbite, but they still have to work through that frostbite on that turn. And sometimes it's impactful and sometimes it's not, but when it is, it's pretty crippling and can be worth a lot more value than what you're supposed to have for just a weapon swing for 1 card. So that ban makes sense to me. I think that it was the primary reason why Oldhim was kind of a tier above the rest. So I'm pretty happy that this change has happened in terms of the health of the format, but we'll see what happens to Oldhim after that. And then kind of the second part of this banning that is going to be pretty impactful is the banning of Amulet, Ice, and Hypothermia. These bans, the rationale that they give is because Icelander was just a little too strong, they felt, and they wanted to strip away some tools for the aggro and control matchups from Icelander. So I think they picked 2 good cards if that was their goal. Hypothermia, very strong card against a lot of aggressive decks, and Amulet of Ice is a kind of a key part of their kind of late game combo turns. And then the third part of this banning was Belittle. Now, the banning of Belittle makes a little less sense to me from kind of a metagame perspective, but they also talked about kind of the long-term health of Flesh and Blood, and Belittle being a little too much value for 1 card, I agree with. It's just a lot of resources and damage for 1 card, and definitely part of Fi's kind of explosive capabilities. So it makes sense to me that, kind of with the top 3 decks being Icelander, Oldhim, and Fi needed to take a hit as well if both Icelander and Oldhim are going to be taking a hit. But one of the benefits for Fi is that the Belittle package was the most important in those matchups. So while Oldhim and Icelander are going to be taking a hit, the hit that Fi takes is in those matchups. Kind of a result of that in my mind is that Fi is going to end up coming out of this as a winner. So now what? The main decks that were hit are Oldhim, so we're going to put that down into unknown for now. Icelander, we're also going to put down into unknown for now, and Fi we can put down into unknown because these are the decks that got hit with the bans. As I was talking about for Fi, I actually think that this is a net boon for Fi. I think that Fi is going to be just fine without Belittle. I think that the rest of the tools are still there, and I think that Fi is going to kind of come out on top of the new metagame. I think that Fi is going to be moving up into the S tier category. Kind of, something has to be the best deck. And my prediction is that Fi is going to be a heavy contender for best deck after this. The construction of these Fi lists I think is going to be a little different, but not too different. And fundamentally, Fi's main game plans are going to stay the same. So I think that in my mind, Fi is going to be boosted up into S tier in the new meta. So for Icelander, while Icelander does take some hits here, I actually think that Icelander is, if anything, just going to fall down to A tier. And I could reasonably see Icelander maintaining its S tier status after this, because the main game plan of Icelander is still intact. You can still play a control game with these Insidious Chills and the Fuse cards. You do lose out on a little bit of sharpness, I guess, in those kind of late game scenarios where you're trying to strip your opponent's hand and deal that last flurry of damage. The amulets were definitely a part of that, but I don't think that it's going to be completely crippling for that plan. So I certainly think that can still be a strategy that Icelander is going to be able to take. While we are losing Hypothermia, which was pretty important against mainly the Dash matchups and the Briar matchups, I think that Icelander still has tools against the aggressive decks to be able to compete very well. While Icelander does lose some capabilities, fundamentally Icelander was already so far ahead of everything else in terms of its ability to do kind of busted things that your opponent didn't really have any choice about. So I certainly think that Icelander is still going to be a contender in the upper tier of the format. Oldhim, I think, took the biggest hit of any of the heroes in losing its main weapon. I think that puts Oldhim down to B tier for now. I do expect Oldhim to be able to adapt and come back. Oldhim still has some very powerful tools in Crown of Seeds and Ice React. Those haven't gone away. But Oldhim players are going to need to figure out kind of what their new weapon suite looks like. Are they going to go towards Anathos? Are they going to go towards another one-handed weapon? All of the other heroes have some very powerful weapons in their arsenal, and Oldhim lost his, essentially. So he's going to have to figure out what he wants to do. I could easily see people, finding an Oldhim list that they really like, and it's going to put Oldhim back up into A tier, back into the conversation. But for now, I'm not seeing it. And then let's also talk about kind of the winners and losers from the other heroes. I think that Dash was a pretty big winner from this. Dash was already in A tier. I think Dash moves up to kind of the second A tier slot. The matchups for Dash, I think, are really strong across the board still, because Dash has that ability to kind of play these two different game plans based on what it's playing against. I think in my mind, Dash's Fi matchup is fairly close. I think that, when you're playing hybrid Dash against Fi, you take the aggressive stance, you try to race. You have some tools to be able to do that, but you're still not as good of an aggressive deck as Fi in my mind, so I don't think that this matchup is ever going to be a blowout in either way. But Dash did really benefit from the banning of Hypothermia. Hypothermia was a card that was excellent against Dash because it stripped the boost mechanic. With the banning of Hypothermia, I think that makes Dash a lot more favored now into Icelander. I think before, when you would go aggressively into Icelander, it was a pretty close matchup. So, with Icelander losing a tool there, that pushes Dash up a little bit in my mind. And then the other hero that really benefits from the banning of Hypothermia is Briar. I think that pushes Briar up into A tier as well. Who knows how long Briar is going to be around after all this? Because Briar's really close to its Living Legend cap. With the banning of Hypothermia, all of a sudden, this kind of previously oppressive Icelander matchup is going to be closer. And then, it's still a very powerful, aggressive deck. I think it certainly has the ability to compete against all of the top tier decks here. My main complaint for Briar is its inconsistency, and that is why I have Briar below Fi in the tier list. Okay, so for Bravo, I think that at the bare minimum, Bravo is going to see an increase in popularity. Bravo is kind of the other guardian, so as Oldhim players abandon ship and look for a new home. I think that Bravo is kind of a very easy slot to go to there. So certainly, at least in popularity, Bravo is going to get more popular. And Bravo has some other kind of marginal benefits from this banning, where Amulet of Ice was a key part of Icelander's plan against Bravo. That's gone. I think that Phi moving up to S tier and is good for Bravo because that's a good matchup. Same thing with Briar. I think that Bravo has some good tools against Briar as an aggressive deck. Bravo does a good job beating up on those aggressive decks. So I think that if anything, Bravo's going to move up a little bit to A tier. Bravo is going to struggle mostly against Control Dash. I think that matchup is pretty rough for Bravo. But other than that, Bravo, not the highest power level, just kind of fundamentally, but in my mind kind of slots up to A tier because of the other matchups that I believe are going to be prevalent and strong still. Dromai's positioning, I think, is actually going to be pretty interesting after the banning. So the main pulls for Dromai were the matchups against Icelander and Oldhim. I think that the previous S tier heroes were the decks that Dromai wanted to play against, and they just got nerfed. So that, in my mind, is a hindrance to Dromai. Not to mention the fact that I still believe that Phi is going to be very popular, and that's kind of the matchup that Dromai suffers the most in. That's a downside, is that Phi, I believe, is going to be more popular. But Icelander's still going to be around, and that's still going to be some prey for Dromai. And another good matchup that I expect to get more popular is Dash, and Dromai does pretty well against Dash. But again, just the existence of Phi in the format and Briar, these very difficult, the Rune Blades are all very difficult for Dromai. The aggressive decks are difficult for Dromai. I think that just means that Dromai is going to kind of stay where it is in B tier. I think that the power level for Dromai is certainly enough for it to be an A tier hero, but the matchup spread is just too difficult for Dromai. I don't really think that there's going to be much changes with Viserai, Dorinthia, or Rhinar. I think that their problems kind of still exist, where, if anything, Viserai gets a little worse because its matchup against Oldhim was kind of like the reason to play it as your aggressive deck, is that you're a little better set up against Oldhim. Dorinthia probably gets a little better because of the Oldhim matchup. Oldhim going down in power level and popularity is pretty good for Dorinthia. I think that Dorinthia is one of those heroes where, if a lot of good players put a lot of time into figuring out the best lines and the best, ways to kind of scoot around your opponent's defensive play, Dorinthia has potential to be an A tier hero. But as things stand currently, I think that Dorinthia is still pretty solid B tier. Same thing with Rhinar. Nothing really changed for Rhinar. Some people might argue that Oldhim being a theoretical good matchup for Rhinar means that Rhinar is going to take a little bit of a hit in terms of its metagame spread. But I don't really think that Oldhim was that great for Rhinar anyways. So I think that Rhinar is going to stay where it is. The other heroes as well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these lower tier heroes. I will point out that the Hypothermia was definitely crippling for the combo plan of Sir Bolton. And with that being gone, I feel comfortable putting Bolton up into C tier. With Hypothermia being gone, you can definitely combo a lot easier. Whether or not that means you still want to take the combo plan into the matchups where Hypothermia has previously existed is an unknown for me. But I would like to see if people could put some time into seeing if Bolton can compete more now that Hypothermia is no longer part of the format. So there you have it. I think that the biggest winners of this ban list are Phi and Dash. I think that these two decks are going to move up into S tier. I think that Icelander is still going to remain a very prevalent part of the format and still be an A tier hero. Briar and Bravo are main benefactors of the bannings of the ice cards, between Briar benefiting a lot from the banning of Hypothermia and Bravo benefiting a lot from the banning of Amulet of Ice. Not much changes in the B tier category, and I think that with the banning of Winter's Wail, we're going to see Oldhim drop down into B tier. I think that Oldhim has some upward mobility. It could easily still be an A tier deck, but it just needs to figure out what it's going to be doing with that weapon slot. Personally, I'm going to be spending some time trying to figure out the new best builds for Phi and Icelander after the bans. I think that those are two of the top contenders of what I'm going to be playing in ProQuests and potentially Battle Hardens moving forward. I think that I'm pretty comfortable maintaining where I was at with my dash list previously. I'm a big fan of the hybrid dash list that can go either controlling or aggressively. It just fits really well into 80 cards, and I don't think there's a lot of changes to be made there. So I hope you enjoyed my thoughts, and I'll see you next time. Peace.